The silver edge of a tea tray rattled against its saucer just as the wolfhounds showed their teeth. In the long withdrawing room at Ashdown Keep, with beeswax, coal smoke, and rain-damp wool thick in the air, every polished surface seemed to hold its breath. It was meant to be a betrothal viewing, quiet in name and ruthless in purpose. The Dowager Duchess of Ashdown had arranged many such afternoons since her son's mourning turned from fresh grief into a habit of absence. Ladies had come in satin and lace, with soft voices, practiced smiles, and mothers who understood exactly what a ducal household required. On that wet autumn day she had chosen Miss Celestine Wren, an heiress as finished and gleaming as a portrait newly varnished. Her gloves were pale kid, her posture perfect, and even her laughter seemed measured by a tutor. Duke Lucien Vale stood near the fire as though he belonged more to the stone chimney behind him than to the company before him. He was not rude. That would have suggested energy. He bowed when he must, answered when addressed, and kept one hand resting lightly on the dark heads of the two great hounds stretched at his boots. Ash and Thorn were feared throughout the county, not because they barked, for they almost never did, but because they watched. They watched with the old, still patience of creatures bred for speed, blood, and obedience. Savage, grieving wolfhounds, the servants called them when they thought no gentleman could hear. At first, nothing seemed amiss. Miss Wren offered a graceful word to the Dowager, another to the Duke, and then, with admirable courage, turned her smile upon the dogs. "How handsome they are," she said, and took one careful step forward. The sound that answered her was low, deep, and unmistakable. Thorn rose first. His lip drew back from a line of white teeth. Ash followed, his shoulders bunching, his eyes fixed, not wild, but warning. The room chilled all at once. A spoon slipped from somebody's fingers. Lady Agnes half rose from her chair. Celestine stopped with one gloved hand suspended in the air, the pink leaving her face so quickly it was like watching candlelight fail. And then the stranger thing happened. Both hounds turned away from the heiress, no longer interested. They crossed the carpet with silent, heavy grace and went past the ladies, past the tea table, past the dowager's maid, and laid themselves at the feet of Miss Phoebe Larke, the quiet companion no one had thought to notice. She had been standing near the window with a work-basket on her arm, plain brown merino, damp hem, no jewels at all. She did not squeal. She did not reach for them. She only went still, as if stillness were a language she had spoken all her life. That was when Lucien finally lifted his eyes to her. If you enjoy slow-burn gothic romance told one breath at a time, subscribe before we go on. Because the dogs had recognized something in Phoebe Larke, and the Duke was only just beginning to wonder what it was. For one strange second after that, nobody in the drawing room seemed to remember how to move. Rain tapped the high window panes. A coal settled in the grate with a soft crack. Miss Wren drew back her hand so slowly that the kid glove gave a faint sigh against her sleeve, and Lady Agnes said, with the brittle composure of a woman saving a scene by a force, "They are over-watchful in new company." It was meant to sound light. It did not. Everyone had heard the warning in Thorn's throat. Phoebe lowered her eyes at once. "Your Grace," she said softly to the Dowager, as if apologizing for the weather. She did not bend to stroke the dogs. She did not claim them with a laugh or try to make herself charming through fearlessness. She simply stood with that work-basket against her skirts and waited, while Ash leaned one long muzzle against the toe of her shoe as though he had known her for years. Lucien saw it all. He had spent so many months withdrawing from the world that his attention had become a sharp, narrow thing. Most people mistook that stillness for indifference, It was exhaustion, trained into manners. Yet now his gaze followed every small detail. The heiress's injured smile, his mother's strained hands twisting once in her lap, Phoebe's plain cuff worn a little shiny at the edge. The hounds themselves, calm again, settled at her feet with the grave certainty of creatures who had rendered judgment and found no need to revise it. Celestine recovered first. Ladies like her usually did. "How very extraordinary," she said, and even through her sweetness there came the faintest hard note, like a nail catching silk. "Miss Larke must possess some magic unknown to the rest of us." Phoebe looked up then, startled, and Lucien noticed something else. Only discomfort, and a quick glance toward the door, as if she would have fled if duty had permitted it. "My companion has good sense," Lady Agnes replied. "That is all. Dogs often settle where there is calm." "Do they?" said Celestine. Lucien could have ended it. One word from him and the afternoon would have staggered back into form. Instead, he remained silent, because silence had become his habit, and because he wanted, with a sudden intensity he did not understand, to see what the pair would do next. At last he crossed the room. The boards gave a low groan beneath his boots. Ash lifted his head, watching him. Thorn did not move at all. "Miss Larke," Lucien said. His voice was deep and rough from underuse. Phoebe looked up fully for the first time, and the room seemed to pull tight around that small moment. "Yes, Your Grace?" He ought to have asked whether the beasts had troubled her. He ought to have apologized to his mother's guest. He ought to have done any one of a dozen expected things. Instead, he said, "Have you met them before?" Phoebe's fingers closed more firmly around the handle of the basket, and after the smallest pause she answered, "No, Your Grace. Not these two." The answer altered the room more than the growl had done. Phoebe seemed to hear it herself only after the words were spoken. A faint color touched her face, then ebbed away. Lady Agnes's fan, which had been lying shut against her wrist, gave one quick tap against her palm. Miss Wren turned her head with graceful surprise, but her eyes sharpened at once. She had been slighted, and now there was a mystery in the house besides. Lucien did not press her before the others. Whatever had frozen in him through the long months after his father's death had not taken his sense of form. He nodded once, no more, and said, "I see." It was an odd thing to say. He did not see at all. Tea stumbled onward after that. Cups were refilled, small cakes were offered and refused. The rain light faded from pewter to charcoal beyond the glass. Yet every person in the room felt the same silent pull. The heiress was no longer the center of the afternoon. The quiet woman by the window, with two enormous beasts at her feet, had become the true disturbance. Phoebe was the first to restore a little order, though she did it by retreat. When the dowager asked for the blue portfolio from the escritoire, Phoebe crossed at once to fetch it. Ash looked up, watched her move, and then settled again. Thorn followed her only with his eyes. No one missed that, least of all Miss Wren. "How obedient they are to her," Celestine said lightly, taking her cup from the tray. "Obedient to no one," said Lucien. The words fell into the room like a latch dropping into place. Later, when the carriage lamps had gone from the front court and the wet gravel no longer hissed beneath departing wheels, Ashdown Keep returned to its usual hush. Servants cleared the drawing room in low voices. The fire had burned down to red folds of heat. Phoebe had disappeared upstairs with the dowager's shawls and letters, and Miss Wren had retired with a headache that she took care to bear beautifully. Lucien went nowhere near the family apartments. He crossed instead through the stone passage behind the great hall and out toward the old yard where the kennels stood. The air was colder there. It smelled of damp straw, leather, dog fur, and the iron scent of rain on hinges. A lantern burned above the arch, drawing gold out of the black, wet stones. The kennel master, old Harker, was bolting the feed room when the Duke arrived. "Harker," Lucian said. The man straightened. "Your Grace." Lucian rested one gloved hand on Ash's neck. "Miss Larke, what do you know of her?" Harker's weathered face did not change much, but his eyes moved once toward the hound, then back again. "Enough to mind my own business, Your Grace." Lucian's hand stilled on the thick fur. "That is not an answer." "No, sir," Harker said quietly. "It is a warning." And then, before the Duke could speak again, Ash pulled once against his hand and turned his head toward the dark stable passage, where Phoebe Larke was standing, as if she had heard every word. For a moment, no one spoke. The lantern over the kennel arch threw a weak gold circle across the wet stones, and beyond it, the yard sank into shadow. Phoebe stood just inside the passage, one hand still on the wall, like she stopped there by chance. But chance had a poor look in that place. She had heard enough to know her name had not been spoken kindly, and enough besides to know the Duke was not a man who enjoyed being overheard. "I came for Lady Agnes's shawl-chest key," she said. Her voice was level, though the tips of her fingers were white against the stone. "Mrs. Bower said it had been left in the still room by mistake." Harker made a small movement, half bow, half retreat. The old man knew when silence belonged to his betters. He muttered something about checking the lower bolts and disappeared toward the feed shed, leaving Lucian, Phoebe, and the hounds beneath the lantern with the rain ticking softly off the slates. Ash went to her first, pressing his shoulder against her skirts with a familiarity that should have looked absurd and somehow did not. Thorne remained by Lucian, but his ears were forward, his gaze fixed on the woman in the passage. "You need not look as though you expect dismissal," Lucian said. Phoebe lifted her eyes. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace?" "You heard Harker's warning." His tone was plain. "It was not directed at you." "No." She drew in a breath that smoked faintly in the cold air. "It was directed at your curiosity." That answer might have offended another man. It did not offend him. In fact, something in it seemed to wake him. For months he had moved through Ashdown like a figure cut from the same gray stone as the walls, answering duty with duty and nothing more. Yet now, in the damp kennel yard with dog fur and straw on the wind, his attention sharpened. "Then satisfy it," he said quietly. "How is it that you have never met those two, and yet they behave as if they know you?" Phoebe looked down at Ash's narrow head, at the dark shine of rain on his coat. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Because dogs know many things before people decide they ought to." Lucian studied her. "That is not an answer either." A faint breath of something like weariness crossed her face. "It is the only safe one." He should have let her go. She was his mother's companion, a woman with no shield but her usefulness and her discretion. He knew that. He also knew that safe answers had been the language of his house for too long. Safe grief, safe silence, safe visits from eligible women arranged under the name of duty. A betrothal viewing one week, another the next, and all of it dead before it reached his hand. The wind shifted. From the dark run beyond the arch came the restless scrape of claws on boards. Phoebe heard it instantly and turned her head. "There is a young bitch in the end pen," she said. "She has been pacing since supper." Lucian frowned. "You could not know that." "I can hear the catch in her step." He said nothing. Phoebe seemed to regret the words the instant they left her mouth. She bent her head. "Forgive me, I have spoken beyond my place." But Lucian was no longer looking at her face. He was looking past her toward the row of shadowed pens, and listening, at last, for the sound she had named. He heard it then, faint at first, buried under the drip of rain from the eaves and the soft shifting of straw, came an uneven scratch. Pause. Scratch. This dragged a little at the end, exactly as Phoebe had said. Lucian looked toward the last run, where the dark made a single block of shadow beyond the lantern's reach. "She strained the left foreleg 3 days ago," Harker said from somewhere near the feed-room door. He had come back without either of them noticing. "I told Jim to keep her quiet." Phoebe's eyes flickered toward the old man. It was the smallest movement, but Lucian saw it. She had not guessed. She had known. "Did you examine her?" he asked. Harker hesitated, and that alone was answer enough. The kennel master was loyal, skilled in his way, and old enough to dislike correction from anyone born in softer rooms. "She'll mend, your grace." Phoebe gathered the shawl chest key more tightly in her hand. "If she is pacing on it, she will not mend quickly." The words came out before she could stop them. A flush touched her cheek at once. Lucian might have rebuked her for it once, back when he had cared enough about rank to defend its little borders. Tonight he only said, "Come and see." She looked from him to Harker, startled. "Your Grace, I cannot." "You can. I am asking." The run smelled of wet fur, old boards, and the sharp, clean edge of lye from the morning wash. The young bitch stood when they entered, lean and pale-eyed, her breath clouding in the cold. She shifted her weight badly, favoring the left as Phoebe had said she would. Thorne remained outside the gate, watchful, while Ash slipped in behind Lucian and stood so close to Phoebe's skirts that the edge of her hem brushed his shoulder. She did not touch the injured hound at once. That, more than anything, fixed Lucian's attention. Most people reached too quickly, either from pity or vanity. Phoebe watched first. She listened to the breathing, looked at the set of the ears, the way the paw met the ground, the small tension at the shoulder. "At the joint, not the pad," she murmured almost to herself. "And she has been slipping in the turn." Harker's mouth hardened. That floor was sanded. Phoebe glanced down. Not enough in the back corner. Lucian followed her gaze. The boards there shone dark and slick where damp had crept in under the wall. He felt, for no good reason, a stir of anger. Not at her, and not even fully at Harker. At the house, perhaps. At the way neglect settled into places grief stopped seeing. He crouched and laid a hand to the bitch's neck. "Can it be helped?" Phoebe was very still. "Yes, your grace. With rest, dry footing, and a wrap if she'll bear it." "You speak as if you have done it before." The lantern flame gave a little leap in the draft. For a second her face changed. The reserve did not vanish, but something older moved behind it, something learned young and buried deep. "I have," she said. Harker let out one breath through his nose. "In the coursing kennels, I think." Phoebe turned sharply toward him, and Lucian rose, slowly, as the shape of her secret began at last to take form. Phoebe's hand tightened around the key until the metal bit into her palm. Harker looked as if he had said more than he intended, and knew it. The old kennel master's face, lined and rough as bark, settled into caution again. Rain whispered along the eaves. In the run behind them, the young bitch gave one impatient scrape of her paw, then stilled, as though even she sensed that something private had been dragged into the lantern light. Lucian did not speak at once. He had learned, in the long, bleak year after his father's death, that silence often drew more truth than force. He watched Phoebe instead. She was not dramatic in embarrassment. No tears, no protests, no fluttering defense. Only a kind of stillness that cost her effort. "My father," she said at last, "kept dogs." The sentence was too small for what it covered. Lucian heard that at once. "What kind of dogs?" he asked. Phoebe's gaze moved past him toward the dark pens, toward Ash standing like a shadow at the threshold, and Thorn beyond him, long and watchful beneath the lantern. "Fast ones," she said quietly. "Nervous ones. Clever ones. The kind that break a foolish handler and follow a patient one." Harker gave a short sound that might have been agreement. "Coursing stock." She closed her eyes for the briefest instant. There it was. Not a confession exactly, but an opening. "The coursing kennels belonged to my father," she said. "When I was a child, I knew every latch, every bowl, every sore paw and split ear among them. After he died, there was nothing left to keep. So I learned other work." Lucian took that in slowly. The wet smell of the yard, the rough boards, the restless breath of the hounds. All of it seemed to settle around the words and give them weight. A lady's companion was expected to read aloud, to sort ribbons, to write neat replies to invitations. She was not expected to hear a lame step through a wall. "And you hit it," he said. Phoebe gave the smallest lift of one shoulder. "Would you have advised me to advertise it, Your Grace?" That struck cleanly. He might once have answered with rank, propriety, and the 1,000 quiet rules by which houses such as Ashdown kept their surfaces smooth. Tonight he could not. He had seen enough of those smooth surfaces. They had nearly smothered the place. "No," he said. The answer surprised Harker. It surprised Phoebe, too. Ash moved then, leaning his narrow head against Phoebe's wrist. She let him, almost absently, as one allows an old habit before remembering one ought not. Her fingers found the place behind his ear with a certainty too practiced to be guessed at. The hound's eyes half closed. Lucian looked from the hand to the woman, and something in his chest shifted uneasily. He knew peace too little to mistake it. Interest, sharp and warming, where there had been only numb obedience before. From the yard gate came the sound of approaching steps on wet stone. A lantern bobbed once in the dark, and Gideon Crail, Ashdown's steward, came into the arch with rain on his shoulders and surprise flickering quickly out of his face. His gaze moved from the Duke to Phoebe, and then to her hand resting so naturally on Ash. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, "I had not expected to find the evening's mysteries gathered in one place." Crail's tone was smooth enough to pass in a drawing room, yet it sat oddly in the kennel yard, among wet stone, iron hinges, and the warm animal smell of the runs. He bowed first to the Duke, then to Phoebe with a careful degree of respect that somehow managed to feel like inspection. Gideon Crail was a man who kept Ashdown's accounts, tenants, deliveries, repairs, and complaints moving with quiet efficiency. He was never hurried, never flustered, and never where one expected him by accident. Tonight his coat shoulders shone with rain, and a locked dispatch case hung from one gloved hand. "I was reviewing the outer stores," he said. "One of the stable lads mentioned a lantern still lit here." "Harker and I were discussing a strained foreleg," Lucian replied. Crail's gaze shifted at once to the young bitch in the run, then back to Phoebe. "Indeed, Miss Larke seems to find herself at the center of many unusual observations." Phoebe lowered her hand from Ash's ear. "Only where I am standing, Mr. Crail." The steward smiled faintly. A useful gift in a large house. It might have sounded courteous to anyone who did not hear the edge beneath it. Lucian heard it. So did Harker, whose mouth hardened. Thorn gave one low breath through his nose, nothing like a growl, yet enough to make the steward keep a careful distance from the gate. Crail turned to the Duke again. "Her ladyship asked me to mention that Miss Wren will remain 2 more days. The roads are too poor for a morning departure, and Lady Agnes thought a smaller dinner tomorrow might smooth the awkwardness of this afternoon." A smaller dinner, a gentler version of the same design. Lucian felt the familiar weariness move through him, that old exhaustion which had made every arranged meeting feel like another log laid on a fire already gone to ash. He said only, "As my mother wishes." Phoebe's face revealed nothing, but her fingers closed around the key again. She had heard enough, surely, to understand that Miss Wren was not retreating from the field. Crail watched that small movement. "Miss Wren bears disappointment with admirable grace," he said. "Not every lady would overlook being so singularly refused at a betrothal viewing." The words dropped with deliberate neatness. Phoebe lifted her chin a fraction. "I did not invite the refusal." "No," Crail said softly. "Of course not." Ash moved then, stepping between Phoebe and the steward with such calm certainty that even Lucian drew breath. There was no bark, no snapping rush, only a placement. The great hound set his body across her skirts and stood there, head level, yellow eyes fixed on Crail's face. For the first time that night, Gideon Crail lost his expression. He saw it, and saw something else besides. Phoebe did not shrink behind the dog, nor try to call him off for show. She rested one hand lightly against Ash's shoulder, as if steadying neither him nor herself, only acknowledging what he had chosen. Then, from the house side of the yard, a maid came hurrying through the arch, cheeks pale, apron twisted in both hands. "Your Grace," she said, breathless. "Beg pardon, sir, but Thorn will not let Miss Wren's maid pass the west corridor, and her ladyship is calling for you at once." Lucian moved at once. The maid nearly had to skip to keep ahead of him as he crossed from the kennel yard into the house, wet boots striking the flagged passage, Ash close behind and Phoebe following because no one had told her to stay. Crail came too, silent as a shadow with a lantern in hand, though what use a lantern was in a corridor full of sconces and frightened servants, only he could have said. By the time they reached the west passage, the whole place smelled of lamp oil, damp wool, and some heavy floral scent that set too sweetly in the throat. Thorn stood broadside across the corridor runner like a fallen tree. At the far end, Miss Wren's maid had retreated against the paneling with a bandbox clutched to her chest. Celestine herself was in the doorway of the blue guest chamber, one hand to her breast, pale with indignation, and not, Lucian thought, entirely with fear. Lady Agnes was there as well, very upright despite the late hour, and 2 footmen hovered uselessly several feet away. "Lucian," she said, relief and annoyance meeting in one breath, "do call him off. He has taken leave of all reason." Thorn did not look at her. He was staring at the bandbox. Lucian slowed. The hound's posture was wrong from mere temper. Ears forward, weight low, no frenzy in him at all. Phoebe saw it too. He knew it before she spoke because her step changed. She had become alert in that old kennel-bred way, every part of her listening. "What is in the box?" she asked the maid. The girl blinked at her. "A shawl, miss. Lavender sachets. Miss Wren's vinaigrette case." Celestine gave a brittle little laugh. "Must I submit my toilette to examination by a companion now?" "No, ma'am," Phoebe said, "but I should like the box set down." Crail answered before anyone else could. "This is absurd." Yet Lucian had already seen enough absurd things under his own roof to lose patience with that word. "Set it down," he said. The maid obeyed at once. The bandbox touched the carpet. Thorn stepped forward, lowered his great narrow head, and drew in one long breath along the lid seam. Then he bared his teeth, not at the maid, not at Celestine, but at the box itself. The corridor went still. Phoebe crouched carefully, not near the hound's muzzle, but near the handle. "Your Grace," she said without looking up, "has anything from the kennels been brought through this passage tonight?" Harker, who had arrived late and winded from the yard, frowned. "Only a sack scrap and 2 old wraps from the infirm run. I sent them for boiling." Phoebe's fingers hovered over the bandbox clasp. "Then why," she said softly, "does Miss Wren's shawl smell like the run? And why does Thorne hate it?" She lifted the lid. Inside, beneath the folded silk and the sachets, lay a strip of rough kennel cloth darkened by something greasy and brown. No one in the corridor breathed for a beat. The greasy strip lay half hidden under lavender sachets and folded silk, ugly in that pretty round box. Its smell rose at once now that the lid was open fully, sour, sharp, and stale with kennel drafts. Thorne's lip lifted again. The maid gave a little cry and backed into the wall. Lady Agnes stared as if refinement itself had been insulted in her own passage. Celestine recovered faster than the others. "What is that filthy thing doing among my belongings?" she demanded, her voice high with outrage. "Martha, how dared you pack such refuse with my shawls?" The maid burst into tears at once. "I did not, miss, I swear it. I packed only what was laid out upon the bed." Crail stepped forward with admirable calm. He did not touch the cloth. "This looks like some kennel rag sent up by mistake with the laundry. Nothing more." Phoebe remained crouched beside the bandbox. Lucian noticed that she had not recoiled from the smell. She leaned in slightly instead, eyes narrowed, as if her nose and memory were sorting one thing from another. The hallway lamps gilded the loose, dark strands at her temple. She looked, he thought with a strange clarity, more at ease with ugly truth than any lady there was with polished appearances. "It was not washed," she said. Crail turned to her. "Miss Larke?" "It has not come through the ordinary laundry," she replied. "The lye would have taken half that smell away, and the cloth would have dried stiff. This is fresh from use." That made Harker shift his weight. "She's right." Celestine swung toward Phoebe at once. "How convenient that you should know so much about filth." Lady Agnes drew in a breath. "Celestine!" But Lucian's attention had gone elsewhere. He was looking at the brown smear on the rag itself. Something oily, not blood or mud. Thorne knew it, Ash knew it, and now Phoebe did too. She touched one finger lightly to the edge of the stain, then brought it close enough to smell without quite laying it to her skin. "Rendered fat," she murmured, "and valerian, stronger than one would use for bedding." Harker swore under his breath. Lucian looked at him sharply. "For what?" The old kennel master's face darkened. To quiet a restless hound, or try to. Crail spoke too quickly. "Surely we are not about to imagine plots from a scrap of cloth and a frightened dog." Phoebe rose then, slowly, with the open bandbox at her feet and both hounds suddenly intent upon her. "Dogs do not imagine scents, Mr. Crail." The steward's expression barely altered, yet something closed in it. Celestine pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. "This is monstrous. Am I to be accused because a servant muddled my things with kennel rubbish?" "Companion," Phoebe said before she could stop herself. The word landed hard. A servant would have been easier to dismiss. A companion stood in a narrower, more dangerous place. Gentle enough to be present, low enough to be blamed. Lady Agnes saw the turn at once. "That is enough. The box will be taken to my morning room. No more is to be said in the passage." She looked to Lucian. "My son?" He should have soothed it, deferred it, folded the whole ugly business into silence until daylight. Instead, he bent, lifted the foul strip himself with 2 fingers, and held it to the nearest lamp. On the frayed corner, barely visible beneath the grease, was a stitched mark in faded red thread. A kennel tally from Ashdown's infirm run. That little red stitch changed the matter at once. Lady Agnes never raised her voice. She never did when most alarmed. "My morning room," she said, each word clipped and cold. "Now,
Martha, you will wait outside. Mr. Crale, Harker, with us. Celestine, if you please.
The corridor loosened only enough to obey her. Thorn moved aside for Lucian and for Phoebe, though he kept his gaze on the open bandbox as if he still distrusted the silk around it. Ash followed without being called. The morning room was warm from a banked fire and smelled of dried rose leaves, sealing wax, and the faint medicinal sharpness the rag had brought in with it. On the central table, beneath the lamp, the ugly strip looked even worse against polished wood. Celestine refused the chair offered her and stood by the mantel in an attitude of splendid injury. Crale remained near the door, hands folded behind him, every inch the composed steward. Harker stayed closer to the table, thick fingers flexing once as if he would rather have been back among the runs. Lucian laid the cloth down. It came from the infirm run, that much is plain. Plain to whom? Celestine snapped. To kennel people, perhaps. I see only dirt. Phoebe had taken the least conspicuous place in the room, near the escritoire, yet everyone looked at her when Lady Agnes said, "Miss Larke, you observed more than the rest of us. Speak." Phoebe hesitated. Lucian saw why. Every word would move her farther from the safe, forgettable position she had kept so carefully. But she stepped forward all the same. "The smell is stronger than bedding ought to be," she said. "Rendered fat to carry the valerian and something bitter under it. The cloth was used recently, not washed." Thorn knew it at once. If it was packed among Miss Wren's things by error, then the error was made after the articles were laid out. Crale inclined his head. "Or by a careless maid in the passage." Martha gave a muffled sob from outside the door. Phoebe looked at the steward, and now there was a steadiness in her that felt almost equal to his. "Then the cloth should smell of passage dust and lamp smoke." It does not. It smells of the infirm run and the lower feed store. That last phrase made Harker glance up sharply. Lucian noticed it. So did Crale. "The lower feed store?" the Duke said. Phoebe seemed to regret speaking so far, yet she did not retreat. "Yes, Your Grace. Grain dust, tallow, damp boards, and something else I cannot place." Crale's expression stayed smooth. "Miss Larke's accomplishments multiply by the hour." Celestine laughed. "Indeed they do. First she entrances your savage, grieving wolfhounds. Then she reads laundry by scent. What next?" Lady Agnes turned on her. "Enough!" But the insult had already struck where it was meant to strike. Phoebe's face did not alter, only pale slightly. Lucian felt, absurdly, as if the blow had landed within his hearing and therefore under his roof. He was about to speak when Ash, who had been silent beside the hearth, rose and crossed the room to Phoebe. He pressed his nose against her hand once, and then wheeled with sudden force toward Crale, ears flat, a deep warning starting in his chest. The sound in Ash's chest rolled through the morning room like distant thunder. It was not loud. That made it worse. He stood braced between Phoebe and Crale, the thick fur along his shoulders lifting a little, his narrow head lowered, every line of him fixed. Thorn, still in the doorway, answered with a silence so absolute it seemed like a second warning laid over the first. The lamp flames quivered. Somewhere in the grate, a log gave way with a dry crack. Crale did not step back at once, and Lucian noticed that too. Most men, innocent or guilty, would have yielded ground before those two. Gideon Crale only inclined his head as if acknowledging a difficult tenet. "Your Grace," he said evenly, "if the hounds are to govern our conclusions, then no man in this house is safe from accident and fancy." Lucian's hand closed once on the edge of the table. "They are not governing anything. They are objecting." Celestine, who had gone from pale to flushed in the course of a minute, turned on Phoebe with sudden brightness. "How remarkable that every objection leads back to you. My belongings, your sense. The dogs, your influence. The kennels, your old knowledge. One could almost think you had been waiting for an opportunity to astonish us." Lady Agnes drew herself up. "Miss Wren," but Celestine had found the line she wished to press. "Have I said anything so cruel? We have all seen what occurred at that unfortunate little viewing. Since then, Miss Larke has done nothing but rise in notice. She is everywhere the dogs are, everywhere my name is made ridiculous. Everywhere my future in this house is made uncertain." Phoebe went very still. Lucian had begun to understand that stillness of hers. It was not emptiness, it was effort, and often pain. "I have sought no notice," she said. Celestine gave a soft, disbelieving laugh. "That is always what clever women say." Crail looked down, as if reluctant to speak, then lifted his head with measured regret. "Your Grace, there is another matter which perhaps ought to be named now, painful though it is. Several servants have remarked that Miss Larke is taken to visiting the lower passage near the feed store at odd hours. I thought little of it at first. After tonight, I am no longer sure such discretion serves the house." Harker swore outright. Phoebe turned toward Crail, color leaving her face. "I went there once, by daylight, to fetch dried mint from the still-room stores." "Twice," Crail said softly. "Jem Porter saw you another evening near the bins." Lucian looked at her. "Is that true?" She met his eyes, and there was the wound in it, worse than fear, the knowledge that truth spoken by the wrong mouth could still sound like design. "I passed the yard," she said. "I did not touch the bins." Crail spread his hands. "Perhaps not. Yet from the outside, Your Grace, how is one to distinguish innocent curiosity from management? Miss Larke knows the runs. The animals trust her. She can identify kennel cloth by smell. She stands very near your confidence already. A more cynical mind than mine might call that a well-laid path." Ash's growl deepened, and before Lucian could answer, Phoebe spoke into that thick, dangerous quiet with a steadiness that startled them all. "If someone has meddled in your kennels," she said, "then the hounds will tell on them long before the servants do, if we look in the feed room tonight." The room held for one beat after she said it, as if the fire itself had paused to listen. Crail recovered first. "At this hour?" he asked, and his tone was respectful enough to hide the objection inside it. "Your Grace, surely the matter can wait for daylight. The servants are unsettled already. Miss Wren has been insulted. Her ladyship is overtired. To go tramping through stores and bins in the middle of the night on the strength of a dog's temper and a companion's suspicion would invite more confusion than it settles." Phoebe did not answer him. Lucian noticed that. She had addressed the house's master, and she would either be believed by him or not at all. Ash still stood between her and the steward, low thunder fading in his chest, but not in his eyes. Thorne had not moved from the door. Lady Agnes looked at her son across the table. Candlelight sharpened the lines fatigue had carved around her mouth. "Lucian," she said quietly, "if there is any mismanagement in the kennels, I would know it before breakfast, not after gossip has had a whole night to breed." Celestine let out a brittle breath. "This is becoming grotesque. Am I to sit here while the whole household chases kennel phantoms because Miss Larke has decided she can smell plots in grain dust?" "No," said Lucian. "You are at liberty to retire." The color in her face changed at once. She had expected soothing. Instead, she had been dismissed with perfect courtesy, which was colder by far. She held herself very straight. "You prefer her judgment, then?" Lucian did not even glance at Phoebe before answering. "I prefer proof." That silenced the room. Even Creel's smooth expression altered by the smallest degree. Within a quarter of an hour, they were back in the lower yard with lanterns, keys, and damp night air pressing at their faces. Lady Agnes stayed at the passage arch, but she sent her maid with a shawl for Phoebe, which Phoebe accepted after a pause that Lucian pretended not to see. Harker unlocked the feed room. The door gave with a reluctant scrape, releasing the thick smell of oats, tallow, leather straps, and old wood swollen by weather. Phoebe stood just inside, breathing once, carefully. The lantern light moved over stacked sacks, scoop bins, hanging measures, and the low shelf where dried herbs for working dogs were sometimes kept. Nothing in it looked dramatic. That was the difficulty with such places. Harm, when it came, often wore the face of routine. Creel remained near the threshold, saying nothing now. Thorne would not allow him farther in than that. Each time the steward shifted, the hound's head followed. "What is it you think you'll find?" Lucian asked. Phoebe crossed to the second stack and touched the seam of one grain sack with the backs of her fingers. "Not what," she said softly. "Where?" Then she moved to another, then another. Her plain skirt brushed the dusty floorboards. Ash paced one turn behind her and stopped. "There," Harker muttered. Lucian came closer. One of the sacks looked ordinary until one noticed the thread. The top seam had been opened and stitched shut again, but not with the same twine as the others. And when Phoebe pressed the burlap and lifted her fingers, a bitter smell rose through the grain, one he had never before noticed and would not forget after that night. The bitter smell seemed to thicken once the sack had been found. Harker slit the resewn seam with his pocket-knife while Lucian held the lantern close. Oats and meal spilled in a dull little slide into the waiting scoop, harmless to the eye, ordinary as every supper ever poured for a working dog. Phoebe bent over it, not touching at first, only breathing once above the grain. Then she pinched a little between finger and thumb and rubbed it lightly. The scent came sharper. Bitter root, something dried and ground too fine, and the faint oily trace that had clung to the kennel rag. "Who filled this sack?" Lucian asked. Harker's jaw set. "It came up with the last yard delivery, marked proper, stacked with the others." Creel answered before the old man could say more. "Then we are speaking of store error, not intrigue. Feed merchants stretch mixtures every season. A careless hand at a mill can spoil a batch." Phoebe looked up. Dust clung pale to her fingertips. "A careless hand does not open one sack in a stack, alter it, and stitch it shut again with different twine." Creel met her gaze. "And yet here we are being instructed in warehouse practice by a lady's companion." The words were mild. The contempt in them was not. Lucian felt the old coldness come over him then, the one people mistook for calm. "Enough. This sack is to be sealed and set aside. No dog in this house touches so much as a crumb from this row until Harker says it is clean." He straightened. "And the lower store is locked tonight." A flicker crossed Creel's face. Small, quick, seen by almost no one. But Phoebe saw it, and because she saw it, so did Lucian. By morning, Ashdown was outwardly in order again, which only meant the trouble had gone underground. Fires were lit, breakfast appeared. Doors opened and shut with proper quiet. Yet whispers moved faster than trays. A guest's bandbox, a kennel rag, the Duke in the store after midnight with Miss Larke and the Hounds. You know how houses work. Stone keeps voices for years, but servants carry them by noon. Lady Agnes received Phoebe in the small morning parlor with unusual formality, as if privacy itself now required ceremony. The dowager was pale from little sleep, though her cap strings were smooth and exact. "You must avoid the lower passages for a day or two," she said. "Not because I doubt you, because I understand people." Phoebe stood with her hands folded and said, "Yes, Your Grace." Agnes's eyes softened briefly. "This house has not been kind to unprotected women." Before Phoebe could answer, the breakfast bell sounded distantly through the corridor. Then came another sound, smaller and uglier. Laughter, checked too late. When Phoebe entered the breakfast room beside the dowager, the conversation stopped on a thread. Celestine sat at the window in pearl gray silk, all composure restored. Crail stood near the sideboard with the account book he had no reason to carry into breakfast. Lucien was already at table, one hand resting on Thorne's neck. Ash lay at his feet, head up, eyes on the door. Celestine smiled as Phoebe took the place set farthest from the hearth. "Miss Larke," she said sweetly, "I hope you slept well after your triumph in the stores. One hears you have quite a talent for discovering tampered feed, especially where an heiress is concerned." Phoebe did not answer at once. The breakfast room was bright with weak morning light and all the hard polish of a house trying to pretend it had slept. Silver flashed, coffee steamed. A knife touched porcelain somewhere down the sideboard and then stopped because everyone was listening. Celestine's tone had been airy enough for the words to pass, but the insult beneath them was clean and public. Phoebe set down her cup with careful fingers. "I would much rather have found nothing, Miss Wren." "That is very prettily said." Celestine buttered a piece of toast she did not mean to eat. "Still, one cannot help observing that every little household disturbance now seems to improve Miss Larke's importance." Lady Agnes made a low sound of warning, but Crail had already opened the account book in his hands, though he was not reading it. He stood there as if figures might defend him from discomfort. "Her ladyship only means," he said smoothly, "that unusual intimacy between ranks invites misunderstanding. Servants chatter, guests take alarm. The dignity of a great house is fragile in such matters." Lucien looked up from his untouched plate. "Then perhaps the house should concern itself less with dignity and more with who altered my stores." Crail bowed his head slightly. "With respect, Your Grace, both concerns may be the same. A gentleman's kennels do not become a theater for insinuation without cost." Phoebe heard it as Lucien did. Theater. Insinuation. Not evidence. Not warning. A woman of her standing could be made to seem theatrical merely by telling the truth too early. Celestine laid down her knife. "Let us be plain, since delicacy serves no one. Miss Larke has made herself noticed in a manner quite beyond her station. The dogs choose her, the servants repeat her observations, and now my own name is dragged into kennel ugliness. If I were a suspicious woman, I might suppose she has found an ambitious path where ribbons and reading aloud would never have led her." The room chilled, though the fire was lit. Phoebe's face went white, then steady. "You mistake me." "Do I?" Celestine asked softly. "A quiet face is not always an innocent one." Ash rose before Lucien could speak. That was what made the movement so arresting. He simply got to his feet and crossed the hearthrug to Phoebe's chair, where he sat down with grave certainty against her skirts. Thorne followed a heartbeat later and settled on her other side. The pair formed a wall around her so complete that even the footman by the urn stared openly. No one laughed now. Crail shut the account book. "This is precisely the difficulty," he said. "Whether by design or accident, Miss Larke has become the center of a dangerous impression. Until the feed matter is properly examined, perhaps it would be wise if she withdrew from the principal rooms. A little quiet may preserve everyone from further misreading. Lady Agnes looked sharply at him. Withdraw where? There is the dower cottage beyond the yew-walk, he said. Comfortable enough for a temporary arrangement. Phoebe did not move. Lucian did. His chair scraped once across the floor stones. But before he could answer, a servant burst into the room from the west passage, breathless and pale. Your Grace, Ash was right to leave his bowl. Thorns, too. Harker says there's another sack split open in the lower store, and the smell is worse. The breakfast room broke apart at once. Lucian was on his feet before the servant had finished speaking. His chair went back with a hard scrape over the floor, and both hounds rose with him as naturally as breath. Celestine set down her cup with a little click, annoyed at being interrupted in the middle of her own cruelty. Crail closed the account book in one neat motion. Lady Agnes did not speak for a moment, but the look she turned upon the messenger was enough to send him 2 steps farther into the room. Who found it? Lucian asked. Harker, Your Grace. He says one of the lower sacks was torn near the back wall. The meal beneath smells bitter, same as the first. Phoebe did not move from her place, yet every part of her had gone alert. Lucian saw it and hated all at once that the room had learned to read her watchfulness as accusation instead of care. Crail gave a quiet sigh, almost as if burdened by the stupidity of events. And the stores must be shut entirely until they are inspected. An inconvenience, but manageable. His gaze shifted, measured and deliberate, to Phoebe. Though I must again observe that Miss Larke's presence near every such discovery can only deepen the household talk. That was too much. Lucian turned on him with a coldness that emptied the room. You may observe whatever you please in private, Mr. Crail. In my hearing, you will confine yourself to facts. Crail bowed. As you wish, Your Grace. Celestine dabbed her lips with her napkin. Facts? Very well. A lady's companion with kennel knowledge, mysterious habits, and a talent for attaching beasts to herself has transformed your house in a single week. I call that a fact, too. Phoebe stood then, without hurry or tears. That quiet dignity of hers, the thing that made foolish people think her easy to crush, seemed only to gather itself. If my remaining in these rooms gives offense, she said to Lady Agnes, I will go elsewhere until the matter is settled. Lucian swung toward her. No. The word came too quickly, too personally. Everyone heard it. Lady Agnes closed her eyes for the briefest instant. When she opened them, they were full of fatigue and painful understanding. She loved her son well enough to see what he had not yet named, and the sight of it frightened her. Not because Phoebe was unworthy, but because the house had become a tinderbox of rank gossip, injury, and suspicion. My dear, she said softly to Phoebe, no one is sending you away in disgrace. But Mr. Crail is right about one thing. Talk is already moving faster than truth. If you would consent to spend a little time in the dower cottage, only until this business is examined, it may spare you uglier things. Phoebe did not look at Lucian when the blow landed. Perhaps she could not. If that is your wish, Your Grace, I will go. It is not my wish, Lady Agnes said, and for once every syllable sounded human rather than ducal. It is my fear. Within the hour, a small trunk had been packed. The sky outside had gone the color of wet slate. The yew-walk dripped steadily. Phoebe crossed the front court wrapped in the dowager's dark cloak, one maid beside her, one footman behind with the luggage. Lucian stood under the arch and watched, every instinct in him rebelling against the neatness of the arrangement. Then Ash left his side. Thorn followed. And without a backward glance to any master, both hounds padded through the rain after Phoebe toward the cottage door. They did not stop at the steps, and they did not look back. Across the wet court, through the dripping yews, past the little herb patch going brown with weather, Ash and Thorn followed Phoebe to the dour cottage, as if that narrow path had become the only honest road left at Ashdown. The maid carrying the smaller bundle gave a startled squeak when the pair came on beside her, but Phoebe only paused once at the cottage threshold and laid her hand against Ash's neck. Then she went inside. The door closed. The hounds remained. By noon, the whole household knew it. By dinner, the story had grown claws of its own. The Duke's beasts had forsaken the hall. The beasts had chosen the companion again. The beasts would not leave her door. In houses built on order, nothing is more disturbing than an animal refusing to respect the arrangement made by its betters. Lucian spent that first afternoon in a state too raw to name. He went to the lower stores, to the kennels, to Harker's office, to the room where the suspect sacks had been set aside under lock. He questioned grooms. He checked tally marks. He listened to Crail's smooth explanations and wanted, once in many months, to put his fist through something solid. Instead, he kept his temper leashed so hard it made his jaw ache. By evening, a second problem had ripened. "They will not eat, Your Grace," Harker said, standing in the study doorway with rain beaded in his brows. "Not from me, not from Jem, not from the kitchen scraps, neither." Thorn snapped the bowl over. Ash walked straight past his. Lucian looked up from the feed ledger spread open on his desk. The fire had burned low. The room smelled of damp leather, ash, and the bitter trace from the seized grain sacks that seemed somehow still lodged in his nose. "Where are they now?" Harker hesitated. "At the cottage." Lucian closed the ledger. The yew walk was black with evening when he went out. A fine rain moved in the air. Not enough to drum, only enough to settle cold on coat and face. The cottage windows threw a small, honey-colored glow across the path. Beneath it, two great shapes lay side by side before the door, unmoving as carved beasts on a tomb. Ash raised his head first. Thorn did not bother. Both looked at Lucian. Neither came. He stopped a few paces away, boots sinking slightly in the wet earth. "You ridiculous traitors," he said quietly. Ash's ears twitched once. That was all. Through the thin pane, Lucian could see part of the little front room, a low fire, one chair, a round table with a single untouched tray. Phoebe sat beside the hearth, in the same dark cloak his mother had given her, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the flames, though she did not seem to be seeing them. She looked very straight-backed, very composed, and utterly alone. Something tore a little deeper in him then. He had told himself the arrangement was temporary, prudent, necessary. He had let caution and rank and his mother's fear do what his own will should have prevented. And the dogs, who owed society nothing, had judged the matter in an instant and refused the verdict. Ash rose slowly and came one step nearer the door. Then he placed one long paw across the threshold stone and looked back at Lucian with grave, unwavering eyes, as if asking him, plainly as any man might have done, "Well, are you coming in or not?" He went in. The latch lifted with a small, dry click, and at once the cottage warmth met the rain on his coat. Beeswax, wool, a little lavender from the cloak his mother had sent, and underneath it all, the clean, faint scent of peat smoke. The front room was modest enough to shame the great house by comparison. One narrow settle, one round table, one low shelf of books, one fire doing its honest best. Phoebe rose when he entered, though she must have known it was him from the dog's silence. "Your Grace." The formality hurt him more than it should have. Ash came in behind Lucian and lay down by the hearth as if the place had been his for years. Thorn remained at the threshold a moment longer, listening to the weather, then settled across the inside of the door. Guarding the world from interruption now, Lucian thought. I did not come as your grace, he said, and heard how strange that sounded. He took off his gloves, damp and dark with rain. I came because they would not eat, because they would not leave you, because I have let matters go too far. Phoebe looked at the fire. You are not answerable for every unkind word spoken in your house. I am answerable for what is done under my roof. At that, her hands tightened once around each other. Lucian crossed to the table. The untouched tray sat there still, broth gone skin cold, bread unbroken. And you have not eaten either. I was not hungry. That was false, and both of them knew it. Yet he did not press her on that. There were sharper truths waiting. Tell me everything, he said. Not what can be said safely. Everything you noticed. Every smell, every hour, every person who had reason to be near those sacks. She was silent long enough that the fire shifted and dropped a red spark inward. Then she nodded. What followed was plain, exact, and far more dangerous than tears might have been. Phoebe spoke of the first odd bitterness she noticed under the oatmeal, of the resown twine, of Ash turning from one bowl and not another, of Crail's cuff carrying grain dust finer than the upper store used, of the rag in Celestine's bandbox smelling not only of the infirm run, but of the lower bins where tallow and herb powders were kept. She did not accuse wildly. She laid each thing down as a handler lays out tack before a hard ride, one piece after the next. Lucian listened. When she finished, the room seemed smaller than before. There is one thing more, she said quietly. He looked up. Phoebe hesitated for the first time that evening. The morning the first altered sack was found, Miss Wren's maid carried a folded note out through the side court. I was in the still-room garden. She gave it to Mr. Crail by the ash gate. Lucian's face changed with something colder than surprise alone. Are you certain? Yes. Did you see whose hand had written it? No, only the seal, blue wax. She drew a breath. Miss Wren's desk wax is blue. The cottage fell very still. Outside, rain brushed the window like fingers. At the door, Thorn lifted his head. Then, from somewhere in the dark beyond the cottage wall, came the crunch of a boot on gravel, followed by another, deliberate and slow, stopping just outside the window. Nobody in the cottage moved for half a breath. Then Thorn was up, silent and long as a thrown spear, crossing to the window with such speed that the little room seemed suddenly too small to contain him. Ash followed, not rushing, but lowering his head in that dreadful calm that always came before decision. Phoebe set her hand to the table edge. Lucian turned toward the glass just as a shadow slipped past it, dark against the rain-silvered pane. He was at the door in 2 strides. Cold air rushed in when he opened it. The herb patch bent under the weather, and the gravel shone black beneath the cottage lamp. For a second there was nothing to see but dripping yews and the pale wash of mist beyond them. Then, near the side path, a shape broke from the hedge and ran. "Stay inside," Lucian said over his shoulder. He went after the man without waiting to hear whether he was obeyed. Ash bounded ahead of him, nails tearing at wet earth. Thorn shot low along the path like an arrow released. The figure was fast, cloak flapping dark and heavy, boots slipping once on the stones before finding purchase again. He knew the grounds well enough to cut for the ash gate instead of the main walk. That, more than anything, sharpened Lucian's certainty. The chase ended quickly. because Thorn reached him first. The hound did not spring for throat or hand. He swerved in front, wheeled, and blocked the narrow path with his whole body. Ash came in from the side. Between them, they pinned the runner against the mossed wall where the yews met the kitchen garden.
"Don't let them at me,"
the man gasped. Lucian recognized the voice before he reached him. Jim Porter, one of the younger stable hands. Mud to the knees, breath sour with fear, cap gone, eyes rolling white in the lampglow from the distant cottage door. "Why were you at the window?" Lucian asked. Jim stared at the dogs, not at him.
"I only came to see if the lady had settled, sir. Mr. Crail said—"
He stopped. Lucian's face changed at once. Mr. Crail said what? The boy swallowed. Rain slid down his temples. Said the house was in a taking. Said I was to make sure no trouble came from the cottage. Only that, sir. I never touched the feed. I swear it on my mother. Ash's lip lifted. Jim flinched. Phoebe had come out after all, wrapped in the dowager's cloak, her dark hair loosened by the damp. She stood just within the cottage light, one hand braced on the doorframe, not trembling, only very pale. Lucian saw her, and saw too that she was listening to every word with the same painful care she brought to lame hounds and bitter grain. "Who gave you the note to carry?" she asked. Jim looked at her as if he had not expected her voice to matter here. "No note, miss," he blurted. Then, seeing Lucian's expression, he crumpled at once. "No, that's a lie. A folded paper, blue wax, from Miss Wren's maid to Mr. Crail by the ash gate. Only once, miss, I swear, and I never read it." The rain softened. Even the hounds seemed to listen harder. Lucian took one step closer. "You will repeat that before my mother in the morning." Jim nodded wildly, and from the darkness beyond the yew wall came another sound, the slow, deliberate clap of hands. The sound came once more, soft and measured, from beyond the yew wall. Lucian turned sharply. Ash and Thorn had already wheeled toward it, bodies taut, ears pricked, their attention cutting through rain and darkness like drawn wire. For one charged second it seemed someone might step out into the cottage lamp and make the whole ugly business plain by force. Instead, only a voice came over the wall, light, almost amused. "Well done, Your Grace. Your dogs have become very theatrical." Celestine Wren. Phoebe went still in the doorway. Jim made a strangled sound and would have bolted if Thorn had not shifted half an inch and frozen him where he stood. Lucian felt a black, astonishing calm settle over him, much cleaner than the numbness he had lived in for months. "Miss Wren," he said into the rain, "you will show yourself." A pause, then the rustle of silk against wet branches, and she emerged by degrees from the side path, hood thrown over pale hair, her maid hovering behind her with a shuttered lantern. She looked chilled, but not frightened. Indignant, yes. Cornered, perhaps, yet still too sure of her own footing. "I came because the whole house is whispering, and no one thought to inform me where my own maid had gone," she said. "Imagine my surprise to find midnight assemblies in cottages and stable boys making scenes in the rain." Jim blurted, "I didn't mean to, miss. Quiet," Lucian said. Celestine's eyes flicked to Phoebe. "This is all very useful for her, is it not? Every fresh alarm gathers you nearer together." Phoebe might once have lowered her gaze. She did not now. "If you have done no wrong, Miss Wren, then truth cannot injure you." Celestine laughed. "Truth? In a great house? My dear Miss Larke, what innocence." That sentence lingered after she had gone, because she did go, once Lucian ordered her back to the keep and sent her maid with her. Jim was put under Harker's watch till morning. The dogs stayed at the cottage. Lucian stayed too long at the threshold after the others had been marched away, saying little, thinking too much. By dawn, Ashdown felt less like a house than a field before a storm. Lady Agnes received her son and Phoebe together in the small blue salon, with the curtains only half drawn and the tea untouched between them. She listened without interruption while Jim's statement was repeated, while the altered sacks were named, while Phoebe described again the seal she had seen at the ash gate. When all was said, the dowager sat very still, one hand resting on the arm of her chair. "If I dismiss Miss Wren now on a servant's word and suspicions gathered in darkness," she said at last, "her family will cry slander, and Crail will deny all. If I do nothing, I leave this house under a cloud, and Miss Larke exposed to every poisonous tongue in the county." Lucian's voice was low. "Then we force the truth into daylight." Agnes looked at him. "How?" He did not answer immediately. It was Phoebe who did. "The county coursing meet," she said. Both mother and son turned to her. Her face was pale from the night's strain, but her eyes were clear. Crail cannot resist appearing useful there. The sporting men trust his management. The hounds will be handled in public. The stores, the records, the dog's condition, everything comes under more eyes than he can govern. Lady Agnes drew a careful breath. "And you would have us carry scandal out before the county?" Phoebe's fingers closed lightly over each other. "I would have you carry proof, Your Grace, if you dare to let me stand where everyone can see me." That question lingered in the blue salon long after Phoebe had spoken it. Lady Agnes turned her gaze to the window, where the morning hung gray over the lawns, and every pane held a trembling wash of rain. Public exposure had always been the one thing she most wished to avoid. A family might survive private sorrow. It did not survive ridicule nearly so well. Yet something in her face had changed since the night before. Fear was still there, yes, but no longer ruling alone. "The county meet was arranged months ago," she said at last. "If we withdraw now, we invite remark. If we attend under a cloud, we invite a different kind of remark. Either way, the county will have its entertainment." Lucian stood beside the hearth, one hand on the mantel, his expression hard and thoughtful. "Then let it have the truth instead." Phoebe did not lower her eyes. She had crossed too much ground for that now. "Crail will be there," she said. "He always oversees the field stores and the coursing slips. Men trust what they are used to seeing. He depends on that." "And Miss Wren?" Lady Agnes asked. Phoebe's fingers folded more tightly. "She will come if she believes appearances can still be saved." Lucian gave a short, humorless breath. "She will come." The matter, once spoken aloud, moved quickly. Harker was ordered to seal every suspect sack and keep the kennel ledgers under lock. Jim Porter was confined to duty within sight of the yard until he gave his statement before the dowager again. Crail was not dismissed, not yet. That would only send him running to prepare his defense. Instead, Lucian informed him, in the plainest possible terms, that all kennel arrangements for the meet would proceed exactly as planned, under closer supervision than usual. Crail received that news with admirable composure. "Of course, Your Grace," he said. "I live only to preserve the honor of Ashdown." Lucian, who had once let such phrases pass because they cost less than challenging them, looked at the man until the words seemed to sour in the air between them. Meanwhile, the house shifted into its pre-departure bustle. Harness checked, cloaks brushed, hampers packed, footmen sent running across wet courts with lists and straps and messages. And beneath all that proper movement ran another current, sharper, meaner, more excited. Servants had begun choosing sides in their hearts, though most would never say so aloud. The hounds had made their judgment early. Now the house was catching up. Phoebe remained in the cottage through the day at Lady Agnes's insistence, but she was no longer hidden in quite the same way. Orders went out in her hand. Harker came and went through her door. Even Lucian crossed the U-walk twice before dusk, once with kennel papers, once with no excuse at all. Each visit was brief. Each left the room changed. Toward evening, when the wind had dropped and the air smelled of wet bark and chimney smoke, Lady Agnes herself came to the cottage. "You must attend tomorrow," she said, standing in the doorway with her black gloves still on. "You will ride in my carriage and sit beside me." Not as a curiosity or an apology. Phoebe looked at her with quiet astonishment. Agnes's mouth tightened. "If the county is to stare, let it do so correctly." That might almost have become comfort, if not for what followed. At supper in the great dining room, before half the household and all the guests still lingering at Ashdown, Celestine Wren raised her glass with a soft smile and said, "How lovely! Then tomorrow we shall all see whether dogs make sound witnesses or only devoted accomplices." The county meet dawned under a sky the color of pewter. Mist lay low over the course, turning the far hedges to ghosts and silvering every blade of grass. Carriages lined the lane in a long, dark procession. Grooms moved through steam rising off horses. Gentlemen stamped mud from their boots and called to one another across the field with that boisterous ease men often wear when they expect sport and scandal in equal measure. Ashdown arrived not quietly, but with the sort of silence that made other people lower their voices. Lady Agnes descended first, black velvet, straight spine, composed face. Then Phoebe came down from the carriage beside her. That was the first stir. She wore no jewels, no dramatic color, nothing that could be accused of ambition. Only a well-cut dark gown, a close bonnet, gloves plain enough for service and fine enough for respectability. Yet because she stood beside the dowager, and because everyone had heard some version of the whispers by then, heads turned as one. Lucian watched it all from the other side of the carriage horses. He saw curiosity sharpen into speculation. He saw Celestine Wren, a few yards away with two county ladies, smile like she'd been given exactly the audience she wanted. And then the hounds came down. Ash first, then Thorn, both on light slips in the hands of the Ashdown kennel lads. They moved through the crowd with that eerie smoothness of theirs, gray coats darkened by mist, eyes alert, ribs and shoulders built for speed. "Savage, grieving wolfhounds," one old sportsman murmured under his breath, and the phrase drifted farther than he intended. The pair ignored him. They ignored everyone. Until Phoebe stepped clear of the carriage wheel, both heads turned. Both dogs altered course at once and went straight to her, stopping so close their shoulders brushed the hem of her gown before sitting at either side, as though they had taken up a position already agreed upon. There, in front of half the county, they made their preference known again. The murmur that followed spread across the field like wind through dry reeds. Lucian felt the heat rise under his collar, not from shame, and not only from anger. It was something larger and less containable than either. Celestine's smile faltered at last that morning. Crail, standing near the way tent with field ledgers under his arm, looked not surprised, but displeased enough that he forgot to hide it. That was useful. The meet moved into its rituals, slips checked, courses marked, judges greeted, bets whispered behind gloved hands. Crail resumed his air of easy authority among the sporting men, pointing to distances, conferring with the keeper of the lure line, directing lads toward the field stores where water pails, wraps, and small measures of working mash were kept. He belonged there too, naturally. That, Phoebe had said, was the danger. Lucian kept watch from 3 places at once, the field, the steward, and Phoebe. She did not hover, she did not intrude. She stood with Lady Agnes near the rail, answering when spoken to, silent when not, all the while seeing more than anyone guessed. Once, when a boy carried a feed bucket from the supply cart toward the handler's stand, Lucian saw her expression change by a hair's breadth. Then Thorn saw it too. The hound lunged, not at the boy, but at the bucket itself, wrenching the handle from his hand so hard the contents slopped into the grass. And a bitter smell rose sharp and unmistakable in the damp morning air. For one long second, the field forgot how to behave. The spilled mash spread dark over the wet grass, steam lifting from it in the cold air. Thorn stood over the overturned bucket, not snarling, not wild, only utterly certain. The boy who had been carrying it stared down in horror, both hands still curved around a handle no longer there. Around them, the county's polite murmur broke into sharper sounds, questions, exclamations, a laugh cut short too late. Phoebe was already moving straight to the grass. She crouched beside the spill, one gloved hand hovering above it, then pinched a little of the wet mash between finger and thumb. The smell rose bitter again, stronger now in the open air. Harker came at once from the handler's line, face darkening before he even reached her. "Don't let any dog near that," Phoebe said quietly. That quiet carried farther than a shout. One of the senior sporting gentlemen, Sir Matthew Earl, left the rail and came over with two others at his shoulder. Men like that cared deeply about fairness in the field, and often very little about drawing-room scandal. It was exactly the sort of witness Lucian had needed. "What have we here, Vale?" Sir Matthew asked, eyeing the spill and the hound above it. "Your brute objects to his breakfast?" "My hound objects to adulteration," Lucian said. Crail stepped in before the words could settle. "A misunderstanding, sir. One over-nervous animal and too much household agitation. The feed cart has been under strain all morning." Phoebe looked up from the grass. "Then why is this bucket marked from the sealed row?" Every eye turned. The bucket itself lay on its side, and there on the iron hoop, smeared with mud but plain enough once noticed, was the chalk mark Harker had used the night before on the sack set aside from use. Harker swore outright. Sir Matthew bent and rubbed the mark with his glove, then stood very slowly. Crail's smoothness thinned. Someone must have blundered. "Someone did," Lucian said. The boy who had carried the bucket began to shake. "Mr. Crail told me fetch it from the rear cart," he stammered. "Said that one there, the marked one, was for the Ashdown dogs only. I never knew, sir. I swear I never knew." A stir ran through the onlookers. Celestine, white now beneath her fine bonnet, took one step backward. Phoebe saw it. So did Lady Agnes. Sir Matthew's tone changed. "Rear cart. I think we had better see that cart." They went at once. Lucian, Sir Matthew, Harker, two field judges, and a growing train of interested gentlemen who smelled a cheat and meant to pull it into daylight. Phoebe remained where she was only until Ash touched his nose once to her wrist. Then she rose and followed with Lady Agnes, because there was no hiding now, and no use pretending there ever had been. The rear cart stood behind the weighing tent under a canvas fly, half screened from the main field. Crail moved to reach it first. He was too late. Thorn got there ahead of every man, thrust his narrow head beneath the hanging flap, and dragged out not another bucket, but a leather satchel tied with blue sealing ribbon. The blue ribbon fluttered against the wet grass like a torn piece of sky. Thorn stood over the satchel, one paw planted beside it, while the whole cluster of gentlemen, handlers, ladies, and curious onlookers pressed inward by instinct and then checked themselves by breeding. Crail went white under the mist. It was not theatrical whiteness, not the handsome pallor of offended dignity. It was the color of a man who has just seen a locked drawer open in public. "That is mine," he said too quickly. "Estate papers, private accounts." Sir Matthew Earl glanced at Lucian. "Then you will not object to your employer examining them?" Creel's mouth tightened. "I object to being tried by spectacle." "You should have thought of that before you brought a poisoned bucket onto my field," Lucian said. He bent, took the satchel from beneath Thorne's watchful nose, and snapped the clasp. Inside lay not only papers. There were folded notes sealed in broken blue wax, small packets wrapped in oiled rag, a narrow ledger separate from the estate books, its pages marked with feed tallies that matched neither Ashdown stores nor the county meat's official allotments. And tucked into the inner sleeve, a silver vinaigrette case engraved with a tiny W. Celestine saw it from where she stood beyond the first rank of spectators. The little sound she made was very nearly nothing. That was why everyone heard it. Lady Agnes kept her head forward. "Stand where you are, Miss Wren." Phoebe, who had come no closer than propriety allowed, shut her eyes a moment as if some last private hope had ended there. Lucian saw that too. It moved him almost more than the evidence. She had wanted truth, yes, but not humiliation. Not even for those who had given her plenty. Sir Matthew opened one of the folded notes and read enough for his brows to rise. Good God! Another of the judges took the separate ledger. "These marks correspond to the sealed roll, Vale. Dates, handwrites, substitutions. This is no accident." Creel reached once for composure, then seemed to understand too late that it had abandoned him. "Those papers prove only caution," he said. "I kept private tallies because your kennel master is old and careless. As for the notes, ladies send nonsense all the time." "And the packets?" said Lucian. No one answered that for him. Harker tore one open with his thick thumb. A fine brownish powder lay inside, bitter on the damp air at once. Several men recoiled, not from danger they could name exactly, but from the unmistakable smell of cheating, of hidden advantage, of something introduced where clean sport had been assumed. Celestine stepped forward then, chin high, every line of her body drawn up around the last defense left to her. "You cannot mean to attach my name to this simply because some fool wrapped his filthy stores with my ribbon. Mr. Creel handled all practical matters. I trusted him, as any lady must trust the men placed around her." Creel stared at her, and in that stare the alliance between them cracked audibly. Phoebe saw it first. The stillness of the field deepened. Even the horses seemed to wait. Then Ash left Lucian's side, crossed the churned grass before all the county, and went not to the satchel, not to Creel, not even to Lady Agnes. He went straight to Phoebe. And when Thorne followed, and both hounds lay down at her feet again, in full view of every eye that had doubted her, Lucian knew the next word spoken would change more than a broken engagement. What changed the field was not the satchel alone, but what followed when its contents were read aloud. Sir Matthew broke the first blue-sealed note with his gloved thumb and, after one glance, handed it straight to Lady Agnes. The second went to the county judge. The separate ledger was passed between them all, each page tying altered measures, changed bucket marks, and private instructions to Creel's hand. When Jim Porter, trembling and muddy to the knees, was brought forward and made to repeat his story before the assembled gentry, the last of the pretense gave way. Creel tried one final defense. He claimed prudence, confusion, a servant's blunder, a lady's innocent correspondence misunderstood. But Celestine, seeing the county's eyes turn from curiosity to contempt, abandoned him in the ugliest way possible. "I never asked for poison," she said sharply. "I ask only that the house be managed with intelligence." That finished her. Silence struck the field. It told more truth than shouting could have done. Lady Agnes rose in her carriage seat with a steadiness that made half the county look smaller than they were. "Miss Wren," she said, her voice carrying clean in the mist, "your visit to Ashdown ends here. Mr. Crail, you are dismissed from my son's service and will answer to the magistrate for what concerns the stores and the meat." 2 local officials stepped forward at once. Crail did not struggle. It was worse than that. He looked for one naked second like a man astonished that order would not save him. Lucian scarcely watched him go. He was looking at Phoebe. She had not moved from where the dogs had chosen her, one at either side, gray against the wet grass, while all the county saw what Ashdown had failed to name for too long. No schemer or interloper. The one person who had listened closely enough to hear wrongness before it did harm. Lucian crossed the field toward her with the whole county watching, and for once in his life did not care. He stopped before Phoebe and held out his hand. "Miss Larke," he said, and then, because the old form no longer fit, "Phoebe, come and stand with me." She looked at his hand for a beat, then placed hers in it. The murmur that followed was not scandal now. It was surrender. Later, when the carriages had gone and Ashdown's great doors shut against the evening damp, Lady Agnes met them in the old kennel court. The place smelled of hay, wet stone, and clean wood shavings. New latches had already been set on the infirm runs. A brazier burned low against the chill. "I was wrong," she said simply to Phoebe. "I tried to preserve a house by mistrusting the heart of it." Then she placed the ring of kennel keys in Phoebe's gloved hand. Lucian looked from the keys to the woman he loved. "Stay," he said, rough with more feeling than elegance. "Stay and keep all of it with me. The house, the dogs, whatever life is left to make." Phoebe's answer trembled only in her smile. "Yes." By spring, the old runs at Ashdown no longer stood locked and stale. Water rang bright in the troughs, straw lay sweet and clean, and in the first weak sun a row of hound pups tumbled over one another at Phoebe's hem, while Ash and Thorn watched from the gate like stern old saints finally at peace. Some doors open with keys. Others yield only when the right creature refuses to move. That evening, smoke rose straight from the chimneys, and for the first time in a very long while, the lights in the lower yard burned as warmly as those in the hall. If this story stayed with you, leave me a word or two below. And if you'd like another long tale on a quiet evening, you know where to find the button.